Welcome to the Highland Heights Sunday morning Bible class online edition. We are glad that you're joining us. We are in week 10, week
10 or 11, somewhere in that
week
area.
11.
11, 12.
We will be back sooner rather than later, but until then, we are happy to be together via video. And for all of those who are joining us for this conversation, we're glad you've decided to join us. We're in week 2 of our mini series on the remnant. What does it mean for God's people to exist when it seems like the world around us, and as we'll talk about tonight, the culture around us seems to be so far different than where we believe God's people needs to be, where God tells us his people need to be. So tonight, what we're going to do is we are going to talk through some of the history. Luckily, we have a high school history teacher with us. He knows a lot about this. We're going to talk through some of the history of how we got here, and then we're going to talk about some of the problems that Christians realize when we try to identify as culture warriors, and then the opportunities that we can seize on. And I think that there's going to be a lot of biblical parallels that we can talk through as we talk about the history, the problems, and the opportunities. So, Jeremy, why don't you start us off by giving us that overview of where have we been?
Well, very briefly, and I promise I will try to keep it brief, which would shock my students that I can keep anything brief. I've got it. But let's be honest, part of the challenge that we face is that our culture is not as amenable to Christianity as it once was. Let's be honest, you can see this in our evangelistic, our historical evangelistic methods. If you're familiar with the Jewel Miller film strip, those were very, very good at converting people out of Protestant Christianity. They're not so good at bringing in someone who is a Buddhist or an atheist or something like that. And you face more and more of people who don't fit into that sort of cultural mode. And what's the challenge that faces us is, look, for a long time, Western culture was very much part of this Christian worldview. It goes all the way back to Constantine in the 4th century, early 4th century. I've heard it called the Constantinian worldview. Constantine, who legalized Christianity in the Roman Empire, he did not make it the official religion of the Roman Empire. That came about half a century later under Theodosius. But that's where you get this idea of the marriage between Christianity and culture, and that there should be a Christian, quote unquote, culture. The U.S. is founded on a Christian worldview, but ironically, it also sows the seeds of the breakup of that worldview, because the separation of church and state, which does not feature, that phrase is not in the Constitution, but that idea very much is that the government should not come in and tell people how to pray. The way I've heard the first 2 clauses of the First Amendment said is the government may not tell you how to pray, and it may not tell you not to pray. But for another 150 years, the Protestant assumption basically ruled. It underpinned the entire project. Look at the Blaine Amendments have been in the news recently, which the Blaine Amendments were not designed to separate church and state. They were designed to make sure Catholic schools didn't get any government money and ensure that kids had to go to Protestant-run public schools. Okay, late 19th century. That is where America was. The breakdown begins to come in the mid 20th century, where the assumptions of Christianity are called into question, which meant, unfortunately, that there were times when, in response to culture, evangelical Christians and Christians within the Churches of Christ both tended to identify with the overarching culture. And that meant, on some issues, very much right. The battle against communism, for example. Communism is very dehumanizing. It's also avowedly atheist, so obviously we're going to want to challenge those assumptions. But it was also on the wrong side on some issues of justice and fairness and the way people should be treated. And what happened was, as the 20th century has gone on, Christians have not lost liberty. We have lost cultural power. The basic Christian assumptions that kind of underpinned American culture for a century and a half, they ain't there anymore. More and more, you're seeing more and more people question not just, is this the right way to be a Christian, but questioning whether or not Christianity is even a good thing in the world. And so that shock of that loss of cultural pressure, the attendant consequences, it didn't always help the way we reacted. There was kind of an unspoken and unrealized assumption that the loss of that cultural power would weaken the gospel, which we're going to talk about later. I don't think it does, but there was that idea that it kind of undermined the culture. And so we became more and more concerned with cultural issues. And that's not to say there aren't some cultural issues that need to be concerned about, but the method of engagement on those issues became as much about winning the battle as converting people. And there was a lot of angst, and sometimes you'll see people, they'll wring their hands and say, oh no, it's not the world I grew up in, and I just don't know if the church can survive. And that's the challenge that we really face going forward, is that basic Christian worldview is gone. And now when we convert people, we're not just correcting a misunderstanding of the New Testament. We have to start all the way back at really the existence of truth itself.
A lot that you've said there, and a lot of good things to think through. Mm-hmm. One thing that I have a bit of an issue with. I think we shouldn't say that the church was on the wrong side of the civil rights issue. A certain group of people were on the wrong side of the civil rights issue. The church led the civil rights issue. I'd say that's the part of the church that we should be proud of.
Yeah, that's fair. I would not disagree with that. It actually caused a split, much ironically like slavery 100 years earlier, caused splits within all sorts of Christian groups, and even within the Restoration movement, but that's another series. It caused a split, or at least, didn't cause, contributed to a split. So yeah, I would, that's a more nuanced, but essentially correct. The irony is that some of the most vocal Christians in opposition to the civil rights movement did not help our cause. Okay.
Sure. Yeah.
And that's because what it did was it either convinced or gave license to people who were already convinced that Christians didn't really believe what we said we believed, and that therefore Christians shouldn't be taken seriously. And so that issue of fighting against some of those movements, and look, in some cases it was more of a, I agree with what you're saying, but I don't agree with your policy to get where you're going, and we understand that. But that didn't help, and it contributed to the fact that some people, they lost faith in Christianity because Christians didn't practice what they preached.
Yeah, and I would not go so far as to say that just because a Christian, you're not a Christian in name only if just because you got something wrong. So we look back at some historical figure within the church and say they were wrong on this issue, therefore they're not a Christian. Mm-hmm. No, they were wrong on the issue. It was evil. It was a sin. But that's not the entirety of them. I think it's not our place to decide who's in and out. Sure, right.
I just want to throw that in. If there's somebody who was wrong on an issue that is sinful, God is the one who will show grace, if God chooses to show grace. And God is the one who may say, nope, sorry, I know your heart. Your heart wasn't following me, and this was a symptom of your heart not following me. I mean, so it's, in addition to that, it's not our place to decide whether or not that person was or was not a Christian.
Yeah. So we shouldn't go that far.
Exactly.
Another thought I had, because you put all of history into 5 minutes, you skipped from 300 AD to 1776, and I think you missed a lot of good remnants, of the Protestant Reformation, John Calvin in Geneva. As we think about groups that said, we are not focused on the world at large. First, we need to rebuild ourselves. We need to rebuild the city. Kind of a Nehemiah feel to it. And when they did that, it had worldwide ramifications because of the transformative way that they were seeking to look. We're not, we'd like to think that we are a restoration movement that has stayed true to the original ideals of being a New Testament church, but we're not the only group that originally had those ideals. So
Absolutely.
So there's this stretch of the idea of a remnant trying to get back to that pre-Constantine worldview for a long time, and so we should see our connections not only as a religious movement but also as a cultural movement too, back to all of these movements throughout history. So yeah, I agree with you so much on this idea of a church that feels like these last years have been culturally hurtful to the church. But if we step back, we take the historical point of view, and we see this is not the first time that the church has had to act like a remnant. Not only will we not be as discouraged, but we'll also see a blueprint for how the church operates when they are not in the seat of power, and how that's actually a good thing, how it builds a lot of advantages, which I'm getting ahead of us. We'll get there in a little bit. So talk a bit more through some of the problems that are, or I don't know, maybe you have some other thoughts that are coming up.
Well, there are a number of dangers that come from this. You think about it, loss of power leads to a fear of powerlessness. Like you mentioned, culturally especially, and we need to understand, we focus on this through the lens of politics, and you can't talk about this without at least alluding to politics. But politics is downstream of culture, which that may explain some of what's going on today in our political world, is that it's a reflection of cultural movements that go back 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 100 years. Okay. But that loss of power leads to powerlessness. Okay. But again, that loss of power doesn't lead to a loss of liberty. Let's be honest. There is a more robust body of religious liberty law in the United States of America today than there was 4 decades ago. And almost every religious liberty case, there are the occasional cases that either don't break the way that we might think they should, or don't break the way that don't go as far as we would like for them to go. But there are a number of cases that they have broken in the favor of religious liberty. Now, here's the irony about religious liberty. Religious liberty is an inherently Christian concept because Christianity is based on choice. Okay. That was one of the things.
Except for the Spanish Inquisition.
True New Testament Christianity is based on making a choice. Yes. Again, we're not talking about people who have called themselves Christians. Spoiler alert. So we're talking about real, true New Testament Christianity, which, by the way, that idea was something that just drove the ancient pagans absolutely nuts. Michael, you brought it up in an earlier lesson, so I feel like I can just go ahead and drop this in. The latest issue of my father's e-zine that he does through his website called the Berea Page, it just came through today, talks about this, how the early Christians were called atheists because they didn't respect the Roman gods. Yeah, they don't exist, and it drove the Romans nuts. Okay, and part of them being a cultural remnant is all these civic functions and stuff that include blessings to the gods, they wouldn't do it. Okay, let me interrupt you real quick.
Yes. Please continue the thought in just a second, lest the people joining our class think that that's a 2,000-year-old stab at Christians. Actually, if you go to YouTube and look up Ricky Gervais on the Stephen Colbert Show, Stephen Colbert is a famous Catholic, and Ricky Gervais is a famous atheist, and they've talked religion several times, and Ricky Gervais will say, well, there's 300 million gods out there according to the Hindus, and you don't believe in 299 million of them. You just believe in one. So you're really pretty close to being an atheist, just like I am. So that idea of rejecting the rest of the world's gods is kind of a weird twist, but still something that has a fringe following to it.
Yes. Well, and not to bury the lead here or get ahead of ourselves, but we just lost my train of thought. One of the challenges in the ancient world, I remembered it again, was you can believe whatever you want, but you can't tell me that I'm wrong to believe what I want. Gee, does that sound familiar?
Yeah.
Okay. So this idea of religious liberty, it's interesting. That's a Christian mindset, because if you believe that true religion comes from the heart and is a choice, there are going to be people that reject that. Jesus tells us that. Therefore, they have to have the ability to reject. Okay. So if we want religious liberty for ourselves, we have to say, okay, everyone else gets it too. Okay. But what this loss of power can lead to is it can lead to a loss of influence, and it can lead to a loss of cultural deference. And that leads to a feeling of powerness. And that leads us, when we're used to having power, to seeking out the power that we once had, instead of searching for the opportunities to get those power. In some cases, it leads to kind of an anti-doctrinal drift, kind of an extreme makeover Christian doctrine edition. Okay. I'm going to make this over in the latest, greatest style. And, if you watch the games, you put shiplap on your doctrine or something. I don't know. But,
what are you talking about there? Like, what's something specific? How has the church done that, or how might we do it? What's a more specific?
Well, softening of doctrines that the world finds unfavorable. Softening of our position on homosexuality, as just a blindingly obvious example. And again, we need to understand, sometimes what is taken as a softening of doctrine is not. It's more of a, let me reach out to those people and try to bring them in, okay, and teach them, okay. And sometimes that is mistaken as, oh, well, you're just being soft on that doctrinal issue. It's real interesting, the issues about which we show grace and the issues about which we get real firm about, no, you basically have to agree with us before we'll associate with you, okay. But that's one specific example. Other examples, just a doctrinal drift within Christendom. And we'll talk more about being a remnant within Christianity next week. But drifting on baptism. Okay. And again, this is one of those things where getting, people who think, oh, well, I don't want to be disliked, or I don't want to be seen as a bad person, therefore I'm going to kind of hedge on this a little bit. What's ironic is as leading thinkers, quote unquote, within churches of Christ have drifted, some, not all, have drifted in less doctrinally solid, I guess, position on baptism. More and more, the larger Christian world is coming around to our viewpoint that historically there was no such thing as an unbaptized Christian. Okay. So that now it takes a while for scholarship to kind of come down to the pews, but that has been happening in scholarship for 15, 20 years now. So, so it can lead to that, where to assuage society and to not lose that power, they drain the doctrine of any meaning. Basically, in an effort to hold on to power, they defer to the people who now have the cultural power. In some cases, it can lead to a cultural withdrawal. Just people say, forget it. I'm just going to withdraw from culture. I'm not going to interact at all. I'm done. And they turn, and that's it. People aren't listening. I'm done. It's a normal human reaction, but it's hard to convert people if you don't engage them. Okay. And it can lead to people who act from fear. Um, and yeah, well, fear leads to hate, darkness leads to hatred leads to the dark side, with apologies to George Lucas. He occasionally hit good dialogue buried in all of the teenage angst. But it can do that, is it can lead to acting out of fear of, we're going to be the out group now. Nobody likes to be the out group. And that can lead to compromises of, okay, we have to do this to maintain access to power. And that can damage the Christian witness when we excuse behaviors that we should not excuse because we continue to have access to power.
Yeah. So I think one thing, we've talked a little bit about politics and how it's downstream from culture here. I think one way that we need to understand the difference between a political way of thinking and a spiritual way of thinking is that in politics, by the very name of what we're talking about, you are dealing with a group of people, a body. Whereas in spiritual conversations, yes, we worship as a church. We worship as the body of Christ. But there is there's personal choice involved. No one is forcing, you have freedom of conscience. You have free will to choose what you believe. And the reason I'm bringing that up is because in politics, until 25 years ago, compromise was a good thing. Compromise is something that was to be lifted up. These two politicians know how to make a deal. That's a good thing, right? I would disagree with the past 25 years. I would say that compromise is a good thing. It's something that we should want our politicians to be able to do. On the other hand, spiritual thinking, yes, there are some issues within the church. Do we want the carpet to be red or blue? Sure, we have to reach a compromise on purple. Okay, that's awful. It's weird. But we don't want compromise on truth. And in a political world where it's hard to establish what truth is, you take what you can. In a spiritual world, though, compromise, we don't negotiate. When someone says, well, I'll give you 9 out of the 10 things that you want, that's not good enough when it comes to living a righteous life. But the thing is, that's only for you as a person. You are deciding that for yourself. And so when we start talking about these larger group dynamics, it's difficult to separate what are the political issues and what are the spiritual issues. And sometimes people will try to make spiritual issues into political issues. You referenced the church's stance on sexual ethics. That is not something that is up for debate. Just as much as homosexuality has always been a core Christian doctrine, a guy and a girl shacking up before they are married has been a core Christian doctrine. This is not something that we should let go and pretend like it's not there. In the same way, though, there are political issues that we sometimes take into the church and say that these are close-handed issues that we cannot compromise on. And I think that going back to what you've been saying, this is the church trying to hold on to power on issues that were not really of our concern to begin with. When you talked about the removing ourselves, I'm thinking about so many who, when it's not their political party in power, they say, well, I guess it's time to remove ourselves. And our group should have always been removed from this. Well, I think that all of us, at one time at least, will agree with the idea that we should have our place in culture. It's just really hard to do that when you're not in power. And so when you are in power, you should be preparing for those times. When you're not changing the rules so much so that when you're out of power, they steamroll you. So anyway, too much to think about there.
No, I think you're absolutely right. And since we're on the concept of politics, just really briefly, one of the watchwords in politics right now is the idea of tribalism.
Yep.
Okay, one, again, politics is downstream of culture. Culturally, would the culture, the acceptable cultural options are broadening, but also what different groups think are acceptable are narrowing. And the danger that tribalism brings to the church, especially when we are overly involved in the pursuit of earthly power, overly involved, okay, is that you begin to get into this political horse trading and aligning yourself with different groups, and that's part of power politics, and it has always been part of power politics. Factionalization and things like that. That's one of the things the founding fathers were worried about when they wrote the Constitution, was factionalism, and how do we get rid of it, but how do we contain it? Okay. Spoiler alert, they were somewhat successful. But regardless, here's the danger. You start to view everybody on the other side as they're on the other side, therefore that's wrong. I guarantee you, and by the way, listen carefully to the way I'm going to phrase this. I guarantee you there are people in the other party. Note, I did not say which party. I guarantee you there are people in the other party who sit in the same auditorium on Sunday mornings.
Yep.
And I didn't specify which party. You know, this is not a condemnation of either political party. Okay, this is not, and it's not even a condemnation on Christians being involved and voting. It's more of a warning that we need to make sure that we're coming in with the right spiritual motivations and the right spiritual ideas.
Yeah, you're probably right. Yeah, and you know, it's good that we can be friends, Jeremy, considering that you're a member of the Green Party.
True. Yes.
I'm kidding.
Green thumbs, both of them. Yeah.
No one's in the Green Party. It's not a real thing.
Wow. You realize it's going to be on the internet, right?
Oops, my bad. All right. Okay. So we've talked about some of the issues that Christians run into, and as we've made reference to, this is not a new issue. You know, these are the same issues that the Israelites were dealing with when there was God was the head of their government, and the same issues that Jesus dealt with when the Romans were the head of the government. So these issues stem across time. However, we want to take our last few minutes to talk about some of the opportunities that come from the position we find ourselves in, and how we can find inspiration from the scriptures for these as well. So, Jeremy, last part here.
Well, let's be honest about something to start. It's a whole lot easier to teach your kids to be a Christian when they're going to public school and they're reading the Bible. Okay, and that, 60, 70, 80 years ago, I've been told that's the way that it was done. Okay, it's harder when you're sending your kids off to school and the teachers and the authority figures are actively preventing them from learning about faith. Okay, so let's just stipulate that it is harder to be a Christian, or at least harder to profess Christian faith. Let's say it that way. It's harder to profess Christian faith in a culture that does not make Christian assumptions. So we're more tested. Well, what does testing lead to? Testing leads to a tested faith.
Oh, sorry, I thought you were quoting James.
Well, I mean, yeah, basically, yeah. Testing leads to it. That's kind of where James is going. Testing leads to perseverance, and perseverance is part of a tested faith. Okay, one of the stages of faith development. You have your parents' faith, you have your peers' faith, then you have the testing faith, and then you have a mature faith that's your own. Well, that third step, which you can't get to a mature faith until you go through step 3, is tested faith. See, being a remnant forces commitment, okay? It forces us to deal with hard questions. It forces us to actually take up our cross, okay? Dietrich Bonhoeffer had a famous idea. He talked about cheap grace, a grace that didn't really demand anything of you. Well, you're going to live in a world that is aggressively anti-Christian, which, our world is drifting that way. Let's be honest about it. The cultural powers are, if not aggressively anti-Christian, at least aggressively anti-Orthodox Christianity. They don't mind a Christianity that just tells them they're right. they do mind a Christianity that says, no, we're sinners, and God does ask things of us. Okay. We have to make a choice. We have to talk about hard questions. We have to actually consider questions. One of my favorite books is David Lipscomb's On Civil Government. I don't agree with everything he says in that book, but it's one of my favorite books. The thing is that Lipscomb view of a Christian's relation to government, it has fallen by the wayside. Lipscomb said we shouldn't have anything to do with government except show respect for government leaders and pay our taxes, because that's what's found in the New Testament. I don't necessarily agree with that, but a lot of people don't even ask that question anymore. See, we have to come up with the idea of, do I really believe in truth? We have to consider these ideas. Okay. So number one, we have to actually have a tested faith. Number two, there's an apologetic value, and this goes along with that. It forces us to examine our ideas in light of the marketplace. We can't assume anything. If God made truth knowable, he did. If he made it defendable, he did. We don't have anything to fear in the marketplace of ideas. And to go back to our spoiler alert from earlier, a world where Christianity wasn't the basic assumption, people looked at you weird if you denied the gods of the world. Back then it was the ancient Greco-Roman gods. Today it's wealth, power, prestige, fame, money, whatever is the gods of this world are. If you, in a world where you're not supposed to tell people they're wrong, we're competing with all sorts of weird stuff, including weird spiritualism coming out of the East and all this weird stuff. That's the first century world. The church has won this battle before. Now, we're going to have to learn to engage with the world and talk to a world that is not amenable to our faith, not as amenable to our faith. But God's won this battle before, and so he can do it again. We can depend on God, and we can depend on each other. Okay? But we have to place our trust in God, not in earthly institutions.
So I'm scratching my head. I'm looking up at the sky, wondering. I have an issue with what you said. The only issue with my problem, though, is that God agrees with you. So
that's comforting to know.
Yeah. Well, specifically, my issue is this. I don't like the language of talking about this like it's a battle, because I think anytime that the church can sit, that we're in a culture war, it gets ugly. It gets nasty. The issue is that God uses the language of a fight, of a battle. And we could talk Old Testament, New Testament, and views of violence here, but we know that Jesus was very much aware of the spiritual warfare. Or Paul in Ephesians 6 talks about the spiritual warfare that's going on. That said, we go into the world each day knowing that battles are not of flesh and blood, but we are cultural representatives. We're ambassadors. And perhaps that's a way to think about it, that the angels and demons are doing the fighting. We're on the diplomatic front where the decisions are actually being made. And so we have a responsibility to be to be faithful to the truth, at the same time to represent Christ in a way that is culturally relevant, while at the same time being faithful to that mission, which is very hard to do. I mean, I've had a problem with this my whole life of being kind to people when I knew that they were coming at their spiritual walk in the wrong way, and they won't listen to you. Hey, who would have known that they wouldn't listen to me if I was not kind to them? And sadly, it took me way too long to learn that. So. We are over time, and there's so much more to say. Jeremy, should we talk about this again next? We'll continue the conversation, right?
Yeah, we'll continue the conversation. Yeah, real quick. I know we're out of time, but just to address,
let's do closing thoughts. You go first.
Okay. Well, first part of the closing thought, and this kind of folds into this closing thought is, you're right that when Christians get involved and start thinking of ourselves as cultural warriors, that's where things can get ugly, because thinking of ourselves as cultural warriors, like when we talked about tribalization earlier, we think of the other side as the enemy. They're not. They're the battlefield. Okay. Stones River battlefield. Okay. Down just south of here in Murfreesboro. The opposing armies were against one another. They weren't opposed to the battlefield. Well, our battlefield is converting souls. Okay. And that's what, again, to go back and just hammer this point home, we've talked about it before. We are charged with converting people. We are charged with converting souls, or at least proclaiming the message so that God can convert their souls. If we're worried about the culture, look, one of the things you learn throughout that history from Constantine to the First Amendment, okay, so that would be 1789, 1790, 1791, but whatever. Anyway, what you learn through all of that is the sword doesn't convert people. You can force people to show up for worship, and you can force people to mouth the words, but it doesn't convert anyone. Conversion happens in the heart, okay? But if you're concerned about culture, and that's a good thing to be concerned about, there are a lot of cultural things that are very, very discouraging going on out there. If we're concerned about that, the way to fix it is to convert people to Christianity, and then the cultural problems will take care of themselves. We've mentioned the civil rights movement. It's ironic. If you look through history, no one questioned slavery until Christianity came along. And there's nothing in the New Testament that specifically condemns slavery, but if you see a fellow human being as your brother or sister, you cannot hold them as a slave. Okay? It was Christians that led the abolitionist movement. It was Christians, like you said, that led the civil rights movement. Okay? It didn't happen by a government coming in, and yes, you did have to have this to kind of deal with cultural issues, but what started was people who said, this is wrong, and we're going to work to convince people that they're wrong, that this is wrong. Okay? And yes, it did happen on the battlefield from time to time here in America, most distressingly. But what happened was people were convinced it was wrong, and then they acted on it, okay? You want to change the culture? Convert people. And then the culture will take care of itself, because the culture will be made up of Christians who follow Christ.
Yeah, well said. We'll not go. Yeah, well said. I guess the one thing my closing thought will just be adding on to that very last thing that you said. When you convert other people, it helps us to think about the world around us by remembering our circle. This is the Stephen Covey 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. He talks about your circle of concern, which could be the whole world. It's all the things around you. It's the news you see, and it's so depressing. But then you have your circle of influence, right? So what you're concerned about, you might be worried about the whole world, and maybe you have a sinful worry in your life that is causing you to lose focus on what you actually can influence, where the people in your community, your physical neighbor right across the street, right over there, your children, your workmates, the students you teach, whoever it is, your circle of influence is your culture. It's your little community. And when you bring those people to Christ, you have changed the culture. You've won the culture battle, the culture war. You've won it, because that's the culture that most affects you. Turn off the news. I stopped watching the news 10 years ago. It was the best decision I ever made. So that's not completely true. Just the nightly news. I got rid of that. I've had fun. Jeremy, this is a good conversation. Appreciate everyone who is joining us for this Bible class. We're going to continue on with the Remnant series over the next few weeks, and we will continue on until we're back on Sunday morning. So good to be here. Thanks for being with us. See you next week.
See you next week.